uh, and he probably will tell us actually more details that we ever heard. We have Cliff Lejos, who accepted. She's the editor of Responsible Statecraft. I'm sorry, I read it all the time. And she'll be moderating the event. Please, you have questions, be short, to the point, do not give a speech, so we give the opportunity to everyone to ask questions. And here's Kelly.
And how long do we have for Q&A? 30 minutes for Q&A, and how much time do we have overall? 1:30. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm so honored to be here with Nury. Khalid had asked me, and thank you, Khalid, for introducing me and for bringing me in on this, and for the National Interest Foundation for holding this very important event, and to see everybody in person, which is great, to have these events and be able to network a bit before and after. I had accepted to do this and then read the book, and I have to say it was absolutely heartbreaking. I think that's the word I would use for this book. And I'm so impressed with your historical and personal perspective, but also your emotional story. It's heartrending, and for writing it. I was wondering if, by way of, I'd like to introduce you formally, just so everybody knows, and for our viewers. Nury is the first U.S. educated Uyghur American lawyer, foreign policy expert, and human rights advocate. He was born in a re-education camp at the height of China's tumultuous Cultural Revolution and spent the first several months of his life in detention with his mother. He came to the United States in 1995 as a student and was later granted asylum by the U.S. government. Since June 2020, Nury has served as the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, having been reappointed by Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi in May 2022 for a 2-year term. In September 2020, Nury was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, and in May 2021, he was named on Fortune's list of world's 50 greatest leaders. Nury is a respected opinion leader and a foreign policy expert, primarily focusing on diplomatic, economic, and national security issues involving China, Central Asia, and Turkey. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He also serves as the chairman of the board for the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which he co-founded in 2003. Turkel has published policy-oriented commentaries and op-eds in publications as wide-ranging as Foreign Affairs, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Newsweek, Foreign Policy, USA Today, and has appeared on major media outlets including CNN, BBC, Fox News, Al Jazeera, and has testified before Congress, including most recently before the Congressional Executive Commission on China in October 2019. So with that, I would like to ask you, I guess, the most basic of all questions. Why did you write this book? And what is your objective for the book at this time?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking NIF, Khalid and his capable team for putting this event together. We've been in conversation for over 3 months now since we're planning for this event, and I'm grateful for you to be able to join us in this conversation. The reason that I wrote this book, I feel that I owe to the Uyghur people, specifically those who have no voice, no platform, no ability to communicate with the world of their family suffering and their own personal stories. And also, I believe in the power of storytelling. I never thought that I would be talking about the way that I was born, brought to this world, the way that I had, as much as I have been in the last 5-6 years. Through this book, I also wanted to the world to know that the Uyghur people have been subject to various forms of persecution as long as I have been around in this world. I lived through in the early part of the repression that you mentioned when I was born. I also lived through the mid-90s, or 1990s, where there was a transformation in Chinese society and policy makers thinking how to deal with the rest of the world, particularly the Western world. And also, after arriving to the United States, I've also lived through, as a Muslim, post 9/11 kind of hostility towards Muslim people that the Chinese government has taken advantage of in its diplomatic engagements with the United States and other countries. I also have lived through the political environment that Xi Jinping's China has created for the Uyghur people, particularly since 2014. And also have been able to play a small part and participate in the policy deliberation in Washington in response to the ongoing Uyghur genocide. So all of this, I thought, need to be told through personal stories and stories of those Uyghurs who have been subject to transnational repression, those who have survived the camps, and those who have been looking for those family members disappeared in the camps, including our fellow Americans. And finally, I wanted to I want the general public, the readers, to feel that they're obliged to pay attention to this issue. Part of the reason that I call this book No Escape, in addition to my inability to escape the Chinese persecution, is to make it clear to the general audience that they also cannot escape this reality. This is about you. So, business as usual can no longer be the form in the business circles, in policy circles, even in the societal aspect. So through this book, I wanted to accomplish essentially a global reaction and additional actions by our government here in the United States, and also a general public feel obliged to use whatever the methods that they can, that include stop buying products made by enslaved Uyghurs coming here from China, include calling members of Congress, calling the White House to ask for a simple question as what is the plan? What are you planning to do to stop the ongoing genocide? And the same question to our partners and allies around the world: why you feel still indifferent?
There's a lot to unpack here, and I think one of the most important things that you're doing with this book is to lay out the case for genocide. And my sense, as somebody who writes, covers foreign policy on a day-to-day basis, I feel like the American people, I don't want to speak for outside of America, I don't even like to speak for the American people, but they know implicitly that there is repression. But I don't think they know exactly what the Uyghurs are going through and why that there might be a case for a genocide charge. So I was wondering if we could go through some of the experiences that Uyghurs are living through right now. I know we have limited amount of time, but one of the things that has struck me over the last several years of following this has been the total surveillance of the Uyghur people. It is absolutely Orwellian what they are living through right now. Can you talk a little bit about how the Chinese government has used greater and greater advanced technology to keep the Uyghur people in fear, in line, under control?
The Chinese take surveillance, as I profiled, I have a chapter on digital authoritarianism in the book, has been carried out, has been developed and carried out in essentially two fronts. Domestically, they started with something called social credit system several years ago. It sounds innocuous. Some people, even in our media circle, liken it to our social credit system here, credit score specifically. They did not know that they end up being in a contact tracing that becomes permanent since the pandemic. And then after developing that in inland Chinese cities, they tried to test it out in Tibet. There's a lot of misconception about how it started, where it's tested, where it's implemented, expanded. So this person has been in the news by the name Chen Chengguo, who was the party secretary in Tibet until August 2016, utilized or tested out some of the methods, and it worked. He got no pushback, and people generally in the United States, around the world, are busy with other issues, still mesmerized with the CCP, still mesmerized with the quote-unquote China's ability to alleviate millions of people out of poverty. So they're consumed with the things that are not relevant to what's happening inside China. So the same person took that method to Uyghur homeland, the Uyghurs called East Turkestan, with his own security detail, and built this massive command center in a old hotel, the government hotel. This was profiled in New Yorker magazine last year. And from there, he essentially unleashed all this arrest warrant that was leaked, published through the leaked documents a couple of years ago. And he used a very specific platform called IJOP, Integrated Joint Operating Platform, that collected massive data and used that data to order local police to round up millions of people. In the summer of 2017, in 10 days in a small county, the same platform ordered to arrest of 20,000 people. The police cannot locate all of the 20,000 people. They managed to get the names and location of 16. Under pressure, they add another 1,000. So in about 10 days, 17,000 people's lives are just shattered because the computer told them to do so. And no one asked if it's an effective method. No one asked if this person ever committed any crime. No one asked if this person potentially, with the evidence, posed any security threat. So it's a preemptive policing method. It's like a science fiction dystopia. It's much like the Minority Report Tom Cruise movie. And then, and now we know that most of those tech firms, the Chinese tech firms that American people are investing, have been implicated, have been enabling, facilitating the ongoing genocide. Every aspect of Uyghur life, whether you're at home, whether you're in the street, whether you're in the camp, are subject to a pervasive surveillance. Even in your private place of residence and private homes, they have QR codes at the door, on your door. They can monitor who lives there, what kind of history that particular family members have, and also what kind of a history, quote unquote, political history that individuals who reside in that household. And then to make the matters worse, this is much related to the Uyghur diaspora, they forced Uyghurs to go through mandatory data scan of their phones. As I profiled in the book, in some instances, some Uyghurs got into trouble because they were using dumb phones. I interviewed individuals who knew and had a first-hand experience using dumb phones as opposed to smartphones. Smartphones can be scanned, and if you use a dumb phone, older models, that cannot be scanned through this machine, and then the authorities still question you, why you're using, what are you trying to hide? So that is domestic. And then globally, the exportation, development, testing, utilization, and exportation of the Chinese digital authoritarianism has been one of the key aspects of China's foreign policy agenda. Essentially, prevent the US-led technology, the US-led high-tech equipments continue to be used, with the ultimate goal to replace it. One example, ZTE, that has been in the news a lot, has also been added to the Commerce Department's entity list because of its role in the ongoing genocide, along with the Hikvision, SenseTime, and the Huawei. So ZTE has been very clever. They come up with the idea to install streetlights with camera. Some countries, authoritarian, ruled by authoritarian regime, or some countries fearful of their own population, were open to that idea. This is just one of the many examples. And based on the credible reports and public testimonies by experts, there are about 86 countries already adopted Chinese surveillance techniques. So this is one of the ways to blight and the development and build a Chinese high-tech capability to push back. There's a ongoing systematic efforts by the Chinese to test it out, expand, and now export its surveillance technology. I think it's a dangerous trend. People may not be able to directly relate it to that concern. At the end of the day, if this becomes a new norm, things as simple as voting records, your medical records, your private conversation with your family members all become public. So you cannot talk about really privacy if the Chinese surveillance techniques become a new norm. And I will stop after this. Eric Schmidt, the guy who was the CEO of Google, said that by 2028 there will be split even in the internet. The existing one led by the US and then the Chinese. So you can imagine what kind of messy situation that it will create. Things as simple as air traffic control, the usage of ATM machine at our banks.
Can you give us a sense of the timeline over which Uyghurs were subjected to this total surveillance and control? We're just talking a few years, where, from what I'm getting from the book, in which expats all of a sudden couldn't reach family members. They'd go home and nobody wanted to talk to them anymore. They didn't feel comfortable openly discussing or having conversations because they felt like they were being listened in on. How quickly did this repression sweep over this region?
So I need to keep mentioning this person's name. After Chen was appointed as a party secretary, the first thing he did, much like the national security law in Hong Kong, to put in place something called the extremification measure through the local, they have a rubber stamp local legislative body in the Uyghur homeland, much like the one in Beijing. So that legislation or directive sanctioned 48 behaviors that could land you into the concentration camp or get you a label, extremist, separatist, or religious fundamentalist. Terrorist, extremist, and separatist. One of the US-based publications listed those 48 behaviors that includes growing beard, encouraging your children, particularly female family members, to marry somebody from the Uyghur ethnic group, abstention from alcohol, tobacco, leaving all past history, travel history to certain countries, including the United States, all of the Central Asian countries, could land you into the concentration camp. So before even this draconian directive was implemented, the local government started rounding up Uyghur intellectuals, university professors, stage performers, thought leaders, custodian of Uyghur cultural heritage, publishers, religious leaders. So this reminds you what happened to the Jewish people before the massive arrest started in Europe. So after that, after they rounding up, sending the Uyghur intellectuals to prisons and the camps, they start rounding up the local population. So when you listen to their reasoning, even today, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Qin Gang, was speaking at Aspen Institute summer forum recently. He's still reciting that his government is trying to fight against three forces: extremism, terrorism, and separatism. One can be a separatist, but not necessarily terrorist. So those three terms are convoluted. And the international community has been buying into that narrative. Even some media organizations essentially repeats Chinese propaganda. So even if the Chinese had really a serious security concern, you don't engage, you don't set up a concentration camp and collectively punish an ethnic religious group. I can imagine the international community will be this silent if any other country locks up its Muslim population on such a massive scale. There's a lot of hypocrisy has been shown in various capitals, particularly in Europe. So the Chinese are still getting away with this. But the real reason is the Chinese, to the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese Communist leadership, the Uyghurs' ethno-national identity will create a foundation or could become a source for potential unrest, the opposition to the Communist Party. And traditionally, as laid out by Xi Jinping's 2013 speech that became #9 document, the Chinese government has been in constant battle against Western influence. Western influence means religious freedom, free speech, freedom of assembly, free press, all of the things that we cherish and value in liberal democracies. So they have made up their mind. So as long as the Uyghurs maintain or continue to be part of the foreign religion to them is Islam and Christianity. As long as they maintain their way of life, as long as they maintain their ethnic identity, eventually this becomes a problem. So when you listen to the Chinese narrative, they often use terms like they're transforming Uyghurs into normal human beings. The former Chinese ambassador to Washington, very seasoned diplomat, experienced diplomat, quite shamelessly told the American people on his CNN interview that his government is trying to transform the Uyghurs into a normal human being. And today, in 2022, Chinese Communist Party has been given authority, according to them, to transform somebody into another type of human being that they call normal human being.
Let's talk a little bit about the camps, because I think when Americans do think of Uyghurs, they think about the camps. I expressed earlier, some of these personal stories that you convey in here are just unbelievable in terms of the detail of what's going on in the camps. I know the Chinese Communist Party has said they're re-education camps. Once they were found out and journalists had gotten information and broadcast this out, they had done their best PR whitewashing to express what these camps were all about in their terms. But we're talking about rapes, we're talking about physical abuse, we're talking about conditions that we just are animal-like conditions that they're putting these Uyghurs in. Can you talk a little bit about it and also the numbers? I think you give the number of 3 million at this point, so can you talk a little bit about the camps?
As for the numbers, initially, UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination back in 2018, late 2018, said 1 million. It was just an estimate then, based on the publicly available data that the scholars and experts came up with based on the percentage of the disappeared population in specific villages and areas. And then that number has been was adjusted in summer 2019 after Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs Randy Schreiber told the media or told public twice that based on his agency's estimate, there are about 3 million Uyghurs been taken into the camps. And then around the same time, the Chinese published a white paper. In it, they stated 1.3 million Uyghurs annually since 2015 went through re-education programs. If you add them up, the number could be a staggering number. Even if it's 1 million, it's more than the population in the District of Columbia. At the height of the Nazi concentration camps, the largest number of Jews, Romas, locked up were about 700,000. So the Chinese Communist Party way exceeded, even in the most conservative Uyghur. And also they planned to go make the Uyghurs, almost everyone, to go through based on their own public statements to get education. And those people who are supposed to be educated are people already quite well educated, had no issues even speaking languages, specifically those Uyghurs who were taken to the camp in late 2018, early 2017. We're talking about scholars who have PhDs, speak multiple languages, no issues with speaking quote unquote national language Uyghur. And then The second day, the general public, after they were taken in, based on my countless hours of interview and review and research of publicly available documents, they went through some of the very common methods or torture methods, physical, psychological. In addition to poor hygiene, the overcrowded prison cells, they were subject to sexual violence. As I profiled in the book, in some instance, some of those camp detainees, young Uyghur ladies, committed suicide. And also, in addition to that, they're also given this mysterious pills to the Uyghurs that has been publicly shared through Washington-based camp survivors. One of them testified alongside me at the U.S. Congress last May. And it was long, 3 hours long testimony, and she also testified what she had gone through, including sexual violence, getting raped, for example. And then some Uyghur camp detainees, and also those who are not in the camp, have to go through a forced sterilization. Even those who are already in their 50s, having no plan to conceive a child. So in a country talk about abortion, sharing various political views, social views. In China, there's an ongoing forced sterilization of women who are in their even 50s, middle-aged Uyghur women. This is precisely why the United States government was compelled to call it genocide. Under the Genocide Convention, the act of genocide is committed if there's an act to target and destroy in part and whole ethnical, racial, and religious groups, which has been the case. And there's some legal requirements. At least two of those legal requirements definitely meets or justifies the United States government to call it genocide, specifically forceful removal of Uyghur children. We're talking about 800,000 to 1 million Uyghurs, as reported in the New York Times. And also those systematic and deliberate attempts resulting in a significant decline in the natural population.
So when they do get out of the camps, these Uyghurs are broken, I would imagine, and in such fear of what could happen to them, what could happen to their families, that it sounds like the family unit is completely ripped apart. So even though they are back in the community, they can't be functioning members of the family or community anymore because of the fear of what might happen to them if they talk or they help or assist any members of the family. What has it done to the actual family unit of the Uyghur people and the broader community or extended family of the Uyghurs?
As Americans, we often don't pay enough attention to the Chinese words, Chinese slogan. That is essentially their policy. This same person that I was keep referring said that his government is in a business of destroying the Uyghur connection, lineage, and roots. So they have been targeting Uyghur families. In addition to rounding up millions of people into the camps, and also taking that many Uyghur children from their family members, they're also sending Chinese cadres to sleep and eat with the Uyghur families uninvited. And some of those instances, as I profiled, involve sexual violence, and even having their children to spy on their own parents.
I think you're answering it for me, but I guess what I'd like to know is when they do get out of the camps, what happens and what's left?
There's not much left. Two things. One, we're not seeing a large number of Uyghurs, quote unquote, being graduated and released to their families or let go. A couple of years ago, former Chinese regional governor told the media that most of the students, quote unquote, graduated. But later we find out that they were transferred from the concentration camp to the labor camps and the prison camps. So that's to them is graduation. And then we learned something very disturbing in a documentary released through Frontline. There was a police officer who was interviewed. He asked a specific, very similar question: what should we do with it? What are you guys planning to do with them? And they said they need to stay in prison because if you release them, they become social criminals because they are broken. We fooled them under the notion that they will be re-educated, but now they're all gone mad. If we release them, they will become social criminals. What we need is a mental hospital. So they managed to break the spirit. They managed to break the Uyghur families. They managed to disturb the lives of the people who are living in free world, including us.
Can we go back to the Chinese being billeted in homes as quote unquote relatives?
Yeah.
I think this is one of the most, I feel like this is the most understated aspect of the story. That I've seen passing reference in American mainstream news about it, but I feel that it is outrageous to me that the Chinese are sending, is it millions or had sent millions of Han-Chinese to live with these families, and in many cases be watched by cameras and have them monitored and report back on their behavior. Can you talk a little bit about, is that still going on?
Early 2019, American scholar Darren Byler published a long feature story after this visit to the Uyghur homeland, interviewing individuals who are affected by this becoming family program. So 1 million Uyghurs out to the camp, and then 1 million Chinese men and women moved into the Uyghur homes, a kind of a simple way of explaining that program. So those Chinese come to stay and abuse those family members, oftentimes male, and also includes female individuals. I've seen the pictures. I've seen the video of them sitting comfortably, laying down on the Uyghur family bedrooms, and also making Uyghur women to cook. In my book, I profiled a former camp instructor who was even sexually abused at her own house while her husband is in the living room. Of course, I cannot get into too much details from what I heard, that there also reported sexual violence against even younger children, molestation. So we can just imagine how offensive, how uncomfortable that you have a group of people not only shows up at your house uninvited, eating and sleeping with you, but also making your family members spying. They come to talk and sit and eat, and then they leave, and then a week or two later come back, interview family members separately, and they want to make sure that no one is just acting, saying something to those minders, and then go about with their lives, but the Chinese are not around. So some honest answers actually result in the punishment of family members.
Now, you left in the 1990s. Is it nearly impossible for Uyghurs to get out today? And I know that there are many who have gotten out over the years and who are sharing their stories and testifying. But I mean, what are the opportunities for Uyghurs to leave? And once they do leave, as you can attest, it seems nearly impossible to keep in touch with family members. So you literally have to make a break with your family to survive, and then live with the guilt or feelings of guilt because you've severed a connection. Can you talk a little bit about refugees, asylum, where they go from there in terms of saving the rest of their remaining family members?
The ongoing genocide, lack of responses from the international community to stop the genocide, and also the Uyghur community's inability to maintain contact, and also in some instances rescue or secure the release of their family members from the camps, have been causing anguish, despair, in some instances mental health issues for the Uyghur community. When I was living in China, it was relatively manageable process to get passport as long as you have ways to apply. If you know somebody, you can get passport and leave with a valid visa. That was my case. But in the last 6-7 years, China's essentially shut down the doors. In any known genocidal circumstances or situation that we know or read about, learned about, the perpetrators usually force the targeted population to leave. In the case of Rohingya Muslims, for example. But in China, they would like to keep everyone there. They would keep them in there so that no one will go out and share their stories. If you look around today, even there are only a handful of camp survivors managed to leave China. They're not because of at the mercy of the Chinese, they decided to let them go because of their family members having a foreign citizenship. In the case of Nury Turkel, who lives in Washington, was able to leave. I also profiled in the book because her husband is Egyptian, and the Egyptian embassy got involved. But the rest of the population are still there. For example, I haven't seen my own mother since my law school graduation in 2004. My father passed away about 4 months ago while I was on an official trip to Uzbekistan, and I was literally next door. I could not go pay respect to my late father, hold my mother, and carry my dad's casket. I have a valid passport. I have the ability to travel, but I was sanctioned last December by the Chinese government in retaliation against the U.S. government's actions on the Uyghur and genocide. I got sanctioned also by Russia this past May, so I've been sanctioned by both Putin and Xi Jinping. So,
Why were you sanctioned by Russia?
in my government role, we cover Russia, just human rights issues in Russia, and we have publicly supported the flight of the Ukrainian people that may have.
So I want to make sure I get through some of my other questions before, just go back with the forced labor camps, that there was a passage, there were passages in your book about how these Uyghurs are being sent from the camps to factories, and how far-flung are these factories, how big are they, and are boycotts being effective in terms of shutting some of these things down?
The forced labor practices, well, enslavement of the Uyghurs is not something new. While my mother and I were detained in a re-education camp, my dad was in a big camp performing agricultural labor for 3 years, a university-educated professor. This was in the 1970s. In year 2020, we found out about that this has become a global-scale enslavement of Uyghurs. Based on Australia-based think tank, 83 Global brand, includes much of the clothing that we wear, have been implicated or in the ongoing forced labor practices. Initially, this entity sanctioned by the Global Magnitsky Sanction, XBCC, Xinjiang Production Construction Board, that controls much of the world, cotton fields, had been enslaving Uyghurs to build irrigation system and picking cottons. As I grew up seeing it, I published an op-ed in January 2021, just sharing similar perspective. But it has become so pervasive and so global since China joined the WTO. This has been an ongoing practice for 30 years. Through the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, Congress pushed the responsibilities over to the businesses to come clean. Otherwise, we believe that anything coming to our shores are made with slave labor. So those, with the ongoing enslavement of Uyghurs, China has done two things. One, polluted the global supply chain, making all of us, all global consumers, complicit in the modern day slavery. And then two, made it impossible for businesses to even publicly acknowledge that there's a problem. European business of the Chamber of Commerce stated that even after the pandemic, the supply chain crisis, less than 50% of European businesses even thinking about, considering about leaving China. They cannot travel to the manufacturer site. They cannot rely on the delivery of certain products. And now with some legal reputational investment risk, that is the European. Europe still has not done much. Italy still remains to be the largest export destination for Xinjiang produced products. 20% of world's cotton products are sourced in Xinjiang, East Turkestan. 80% of cotton products made in China are sourced in the Uyghur region. So that gives you an idea how pervasive, how serious this problem is. As for our American companies, the same question was posed. Not even 20% of American companies considering to leave in the face of the public pressure here at home and the pressure inserted on them, put on them by the communist government in Beijing. So until the business communities step up to the plate and realize that this is not something that they can continue to do, and that they start looking for a country that does not enslave its population and commit genocide, we will still have this problem. We will continue to be complicit in the ongoing enslavement. And also, the environmentalist group in the United States, led by Special Envoy John Kerry, has not been very helpful. American public has been misinformed. For example, they've been hearing that United States needs 10 years to catch up with China's solar panel industry, which is not true. And also, American people have not been told that the solar panels that the environmental activists promoting to use are made by enslaved Uyghurs and made through using dirty coal. So these kind of things that American people still don't know, even after the implementation of the, there was a news yesterday in Bloomberg that the shipment is still keep coming to the United States. And some Chinese solar panel companies are making billions of dollars. So the problem is global. This is one of the reasons that I quite comfortably say that this is on you. This is no longer just a Uyghur human rights. And which part is specifically known traditional or known human rights abuses that we come to know. This is a global problem. This is a U.S. national security concern. This is essentially affect the lives of many, many people around the world.
There are sanctions in place.
Yeah.
Are they working? Can they work? Because of this integrated supply chain.
Sanctions shows an effect slowly. It's not overnight thing. Even in the case of Russian sanctions, which had been imposed since last February, there's not much we can say that it's been working, but it gradually worked. But in the Chinese case, this is the regime that never tells if it felt the pinch even in a situation like this. But when you look at their responses, when you look at some of their public statements pressuring the business entities, even threatening the United States with the consequences when the Forced Labor Prevention Act was about to be enacted, the Chinese made a threat against the United States government that will be a retaliation. That to me is an indication that they're getting the message. And also there have been various reports by specific suppliers that complain publicly in their SEC filing that they have been losing significant amount of money because of cancellation, American companies canceling orders. And also, I think the consumer activism has been somewhat effective as well, in addition to the sanctions imposed by the United States and our European allies.
I don't want to hog the mic because I know we have about 30 minutes left for audience Q&A. So, Saul, would you like to start?
Sure.
And yeah, we'll do a round robin.
So I have a two-part, almost a three-part question. First of all, just very easily, how many Uyghurs are there in China total? What's the, you said there's like communities, et cetera. How big is the population?
The Chinese government, China's 15 million. There's a gradual, very small increase until they start imposing different population control measures. There has been some increase in the Uyghur population, but I would not give any credit to what the Chinese says as far as the Uyghur population is concerned.
So my primary question is, you mentioned the word compelled. You said the U.S. government was compelled to act or to respond with regards to what's happening in China. Obviously, the Muslim community around the world has not been very reactive or loud. You actually, again, mentioned the fact that the international community lacks. So how is that, like, what's happening in that regard? I mean, why is it just the fact that China is so powerful and everybody's afraid to react, and how does that work? And then my second part of it is, if maybe you could explain with the Chinese government and their what they're doing with regards to being anti-Uyghur propaganda that they're spreading in the United States and elsewhere. Like as you said, making it a Muslim problem, a terrorist problem, or something else. How are they doing that? What are some of the specifics that we should be aware of, especially as Americans, of what's happening from the Chinese standpoint that could be, having a negative effect on public policy?
So, 3 words in response to the first question, why there has not been global response. Chinese have been using coercive, and corrupt influence operations to either silence a government or government officials, or buy out silence from weaker, smaller countries. During the period of 2019 and 2021, they had 3 letters circulated at the UN to condemn the Chinese actions in the Uyghur homeland of Hong Kong. The Western liberal democracies were able to gather about 20 supporters, mostly Western governments plus Japan, whereas China managed to get close to 50 countries. And vast majority of them happen to be Muslim majority countries. So that gives you an idea how effective that they have been in their course diplomacy efforts. And also, in addition to that, they have been very effective at blunting U.S. influence, Western influence, while building their own influence. So one of the ways that they have been doing it is through international organizations. Even UN, specifically under the UN mandate, required to act upon in the issues like this. Even to this day, Secretary General Guterres has not said anything. To make the matters worse, the UN High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, visited China holding Xi Jinping's book. Xi Jinping thought that the prisoners, the camp detainees, spend hours every day to study and try go through pressure to replace that Xi Jinping ideology thoughts with their religious belief, was promoted very subtly by the UN official. So they're doing it bilaterally, multilaterally through international organizations using their economic diplomatic influence. That's precisely, I think, reason that we're not seeing the type of response. In Muslim countries is interesting, but we should not lose sight over the European countries. They have been very mild, meandering in their response. They could have done better. So, and also it's not helping the overall advocacy that if the others don't speak out the way that United States government speaks out, it makes it easier for the Chinese to claim publicly or misinform the public that this is only a U.S. problem created by the United States to hamper China rights.
I'm going to go to Bruce first, and when I call on you, can you just give your name and your affiliation, if possible?
I'm fine. My name is Bruce. I'm an international and constitutional lawyer, Intermountain for a long time. Had the pleasure of meeting Eradicate here. She had offices across from the White House. at the time that Uyghurs were detained at Guantanamo Bay. Sounds similar. Anyway, I have these questions. One, the United States and any other country can sue China for genocide in the International Court of Justice, even if they're not the victims. That the ICJ recently held that Myanmar was guilty of genocide against the Rohingya. Have you attempted to get the United States to bring a suit or to organize other countries to sue to get an official judgment and present the case in a forum that would be very publicized? The second, it's been said that in 2002, Richard Armitage then traveled to China, and in exchange for China not vetoing a Security Council resolution that authorized invading Iraq, gave China a green light to do what they wanted with regard to the Uyghurs, Guantanamo Bay or otherwise. And then the last question is forced labor. You know, the Nazis, when Jews who were no longer useful in working to help their military establishment, simply sent them to Uyghurs and killed them. They were no longer useful commodities. Is China doing that with regard to Uyghurs in the concentration camps? Thank you.
Thank you. On the international justice aspect, I don't think that there's any plan, any intention on the U.S. government's behalf to file an official complaint. But I have been part of the discussion. Maybe the United States local courts might consider hearing or taking a case to address grievances by the American citizens against the Chinese business entities. Most of the Chinese companies that have been implicated were added to the Commerce Department's blacklist, the entity list, have a business presence. As for the China's broader global global war on terrorism narrative, the United States government bears some responsibility. I don't mince words. If it was not for the Bush administration's designation of the East Turkestan Islamic movement as a terrorist organization on the eve of invading Iraq, we probably will not have the Chinese government in such a comfortable way of trying to justify their repression that is part of part of their national security concerns. So even though that decision has been reversed by Secretary Pompeo in November 2020, the damage is done. The damage is so immeasurably done to the Uyghur people. Even if you oppose, as I pointed out earlier, if you have the desire to have an independent Uyghur state, you naturally become a terrorist. If you're accused of being a terrorist or separatist in China, you either get a bullet in your head, life sentence. So I think the United States government should continue to make it publicly that this is not the same type of struggle. Secretary Blinken said that in the 60-minute interview that the United States does not believe that there are, I'm paraphrasing, there are millions of terrorists in China. That kind of public statement needs to be continued to be made. On the forced labor, something that I'm quite surprised, kind of sensed it initially, but as I did my research for the book, two things were very similar. What happened with the Jewish people under the Nazi regime and in Xi Jinping's China. One is targeted destructive attempts towards women and children. And two, use of forced labor. I did not know until I started writing the book that Dhaka was built by Jewish women who were subject to forced labor. And also, much like the Nazi Germany, the Chinese also selecting the ones who can perform labor to the labor camps. The older ones are either remain in the camps or been transferred into the prison camps. So there's so much similarities. Even the way that they set up the camps, you were rounded up based on your ethno-national identity. You have no access to court lawyers. You don't know when you will be released. And if you'll be released, there's no assistance provided to you to be re-entered into the society. No apology, no compensations. Very similar method. So people wrongfully focus on the mass casualties. We don't know what kind of casualties we're talking about now. We know about this scope and severity of the casualties that the Jewish people, the Roma, suffered under the Nazi after the crime is completed. So I think it's wrong to focus on, as some people do today, even to push back against our government decision. Need to look at the history. The perpetrators don't invite and recruit to film how they killing the detainees.
If you just allow me, like clarification. In China, there are Muslims beside Uyghurs. There's ethnic Chinese, I assume, and other. Correct? What's the percentage of Muslims in China beside Uyghurs? Like how many? And do they suffer from the same treatment and oppression?
Actually the largest Muslim group in China is not Uyghurs, Hui Muslims. Do you know the percentage of the population? So they are the largest. They speak Han Chinese language, the Chinese Mandarin. They look Han Chinese, and they share a lot of commonalities as far as the lifestyle with the Chinese. They have their own autonomous region. It's called the Uyghur autonomous region. They also live in central parts of big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Xi'an. We don't have evidence to prove that this exactly the same method has been applied to the other Muslims, but specifically that particular group. But we do have enough evidence about the others, the Kazakh Muslims, for example, the Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, who share similar ethnic background as the Uyghurs in East Turkestan have been subject to mass detention and torture. The Kazakh government has been very public, and they have been very supportive of certain Kazakh individuals up until they were released from the camps. But I can't say the same thing about how they've been treated after arriving to Kazakhstan. But some governments are not saying anything. For example, the Uzbek government is not saying anything. The Kyrgyz government is not saying anything. The Turkish government is not saying anything publicly. But there's a significant number of people from that ethnic group who have been also affected. Based on what I've heard, there are about 200 Turkish citizens currently in the concentration camps. The Uyghur, Turkish citizens of Uyghur origin.
Okay, a couple here. Was there a gentleman at the back?
Yeah, I tried to ask what I wanted to ask, because I know that there are like 10 different ethnic groups in China, and we are the largest ethnic group. But as moving forward, I mean, how do you see, given all the limitations that you've seen and that you've mentioned in your book, what are the things that can be done by the general public, and what would impact the Chinese government? Because it seems like, from what you're saying, they're just bulldozing forward. I mean, I've heard people in the past say whenever there've been, I'm Palestinian, we look at how you might find help within your the issues that you face ethnically. A lot of people will say it happens from within rather than from without. So is there a potential that in China, the economic problems it's facing, the implosion of the economy might impact fragmentation there, and that might alleviate some of the suffering? What would happen next to alleviate the suffering of the Uyghurs?
Reasonable people may disagree, but I don't think that the change will come within. I profiled, I discussed this in the book. In the last 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years, the Chinese have created a kind of a strange society, which is the United States and North Korea in the same basket. There's a dystopian background waiting for anyone, or dystopian punishment, waiting for anyone who is willing to speak out in societal level. And those who might be willing to speak out don't have the means and ways to be informed, well informed about the global environment, for example. And those are the people that I would call people living in North Korea type of living environment. And then the other ones, the American, having the American dream, have access to global destinations for shopping, sightseeing, education. They can jet around on private planes, as profiled in the book called Red Roulette by Desmond Shum. And they send their kids to elite schools around the world, including those in the United States. They have big bank accounts, they have ongoing business practices, they can post TikTok videos, and they can criticize various governments, including our own, when it's convenient. Even though they have the ability, have means to change, they will not say anything. Ask Jack Ma, the guy who founded Baidu. And also, the Chinese know that they can destroy that company, that individual, quite quickly. Based on various reports, Xi Jinping managed to put away about 500,000 senior Chinese Communist Party leaders. That is another type who might be able to speak up, but they have been silenced. So that's the kind of society that we're dealing with. And with that, and also the growing nationalism. I've been paying very close attention to the public opinion in China towards the war in Ukraine. The most pro-Putin segment of the population happy to be the most well-educated, well-off population. That's stemming from their nationalistic point of view, and also concerned that the status quo will be destroyed once the US done with Ukraine or Russia. The China will be the next. So it's a strange society. It's very, very confusing. I wouldn't say the same thing 10 years ago, but I have very little hope that change will come within. So what do? I think we need to be honest with each other. I think that a lot of people around the world in a leadership level, senior leadership level, have been very dishonest. They know the severity of the problem. They know what we're dealing with, but they're not telling the truth to their constituents. We have to recognize the issue. The CCP is in the business of pushing back initially, but now trying to replace. So we have to ask ourselves, are we going to be comfortable with the Chinese, the Communist China form of governance, social control, economic policies, electoral process? So the answer is no. So we have to do something societally, governmentally, in a collective and individual level.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this informative session. I'm Ghassan Boudia. I manage the Demokratia Center for Research and Strategic Studies. We work in conflict transformation in the MENA region after the Arab Spring. Two quick questions. First one, for a country with 1.4 billion in population, what do they need to do with 20 million Uyghurs? I mean, it's a medium city, like in China. Is it ideology? Is it religion? Is it why does the Chinese government fear the Uyghurs? This is one. And number two, what do you, as a U.S. Uyghurian specialist, call for as a solution for what's going on, for this horrible genocide? I mean, do you think about, do you still want to be part of the bigger China? Do you want a self-ruling district like Taiwan? Do you call for an Uighuristan? We really would be interested in knowing, understanding. I mean, what would someone like you think about this solution? Thank you.
During the process of writing this book, my publishers and editing team, research team, suggested I might even consider naming my book, Why Do They Hate Me That Much? But I didn't go with that route. That's something that I've been trying to figure out. We find an answer for myself. Why do they hate Uyghurs so much? What kind of individual, what kind of person would take somebody's children away from his or her mother? If you look at those 2,000, close to 2,000 images released this past May through the China Xinjiang police file on CNN, you can see there are young girls as young as 13, 14, grandmother or mother 70, 3 years old, and do look frightened. They don't look like anyone who would pose any threat. They just wanted to be left alone and live their life. And yet the Chinese punish them collectively. This is available as just, I thought that I'm strong enough to be able to handle that. I was in Oslo for the event at the Oslo Freedom Forum, and I could not concentrate anything that I was doing. This is not an exaggeration. After seeing, hearing all this, looking at the images. So as I grow up, I had to deal with something otherness in the Chinese society, regardless how successful, how nice, how hardworking, how contributing member of the society that you become or try to become, you always treated others. That otherness prompted some policy advisors who writes papers for the Chinese government starting in mid-90s that need to be tackled. I think the biggest wake-up call to the Chinese, this is something that I read as I was going to college in the 90s, that they had looked at the Soviet Union given too much right, too much ethnic identity. I know that they have the force to speak the Russian language at the same time. When you look at countries like Uzbekistan, for example, they maintain their way of life. The others the same way, depending on how big is the Russian population. So that was a big, one of the three trifactors for the Chinese to realize that you either become one of us or we'll take you out. You either become a compliant or we'll tackle with you. That simplistic way of creating enemy in the Uyghurs, I believe, laid the foundation for today's nightmare. As for the future, I said this in my recent interview on BBC Hot Dog. I don't have any, I don't represent the Uyghur interest, and I can't speak for those who are on the ground. But what I can say is that at this point, forcing Uyghurs to embrace CCP is almost forcing the Jews and Romas to embrace Hitler after the Holocaust. So I would think that the Uyghur people should be allowed to decide for their own future, whichever the way that they want. So the Western democracy should not be afraid of giving that kind of voice to the Uyghur people to be able to openly discuss it. It's 1/6 of the China proper. It's 4 times the size of California. With everything, why does such a strong political economy exist in addition to the natural resources? Because it's a very rich land. The Uyghurs are both cursed and blessed with their homeland. There's a long international border. The Uyghurs can be a very prosperous nation if they were allowed to. So this is a mindset of many, many Uyghurs for many decades. But there had not been the organized separatist movement within China. So the Chinese claiming that they're fighting against terrorism does not hold any water.
Just a two-finger on that, we're talking a lot about Taiwan right now in the headlines. Do you have any thoughts on what could be the fate of the Taiwanese people in the context of what you're talking about here?
Yeah. These three things are very important in U.S.-China relations, Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. Taiwan is, I think, the CCP, two thoughts. One, the China has a plan for Taiwan. This is not something new. We have not paid attention to their rhetoric, but they have a plan. But it depends when their plan will be realized. That's one thing. The second thing is that next month, Xi Jinping most likely will become a president for life. So after that, we may see even more aggressive foreign policy approach. there's a news in Wall Street Journal that President Biden and Xi Jinping will be meeting in November. So this will be after that he crowned again. So and the recent reaction to Speaker Pelosi's visit also illustrates they are getting impatient. They're testing the waters. They're engaging in kind of a military exercise that we have not seen quite aggressively, and they actually doing it even today with the second group of Codel visiting Taiwan. So we need to stop saying that we're not against this, we're not against this, we're for this. I think that fits nicely into the Chinese narrative. Taiwan is a vibrant democracy and an active member of a democratic community around the world. If something horrific happens in Taiwan, what has happened in Ukraine will be considered pale. It's not going to be comparable. It will be massive. It will be calamity of the issues that we will end up dealing with respect to Taiwan is immeasurable. Just one, the global technology sector will be paralyzed over the TSMC that provides 65% of the computer chips in the United States. About a quarter of China's sensitive technology required chips. Oftentimes, wars result in because of political dispute, territorial dispute, but over Taiwan, as has been discussed, it will be mostly about technology, TSMC.
Hi, I'm Elise Anderson. I specialize on Uyghur issues, and I'm here today in my role as a non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute. So several different times you made reference to the Holocaust, or kind of structural comparisons, right, between Uyghur genocide and the Holocaust. I don't think that's always the only kind of comparison we could make, right? And I would be curious to hear your reflections on how Uyghur genocide sort of compares in broad strokes to the colonial or frontier genocides that we saw, for example, in Australia, Canada, or the United States. Thanks.
The Uyghur genocide, I didn't spend time studying those that you're referring to, but I've spent a time, thanks to you, because of your mentioning the author, the One Long Night, the history of the concentration camps. I ended up studying that history. I even interviewed the author twice for the book. But one commonality of all of the genocide, all of the concentration camps, focuses on ethno-national identity, ethnic, religious identity. And also shares other commonalities of collective punishment. And the third commonality is extrajudicial nature of it. And then the final aspect is total destruction. So I don't know if that answers your question, but from that perspective, I think there are a lot of historical analysis can be driven. The type of collective punishment that I survived with my mother was very much like the Stalin's gulags. It's not exactly like what we're seeing today, because everyone was affected, not only the Uyghurs, in entire China, everyone was subject to Mao's red card. But now this is very specific, targeting ethno-religious groups. This is why I feel that this is very similar to the Holocaust era treatment of the Romas and Jews.
How, on that score, do you think that the CCP view the Han-Chinese as a master race, like Hitler and Nazi Germany felt the Aryans were the master race, and others were interventions, were inferior species?
Based on the chauvinistic, nationalistic slogans that you hear, it shows that they have that kind of tendencies, if it's not totally proven a national sentiment. But you can tell, even in these speeches delivered by Xi Jinping, you can sense that they are chosen people their own way. The transformation that I mentioned, to them, the transformation has just become a contract. Because to them, the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and the Kazakhs and Uzbeks are inferior. Therefore, they should be adopting their way of life, their language, their culture.
The last thing, I was told by Eradicate that the Chinese oftentimes send Uyghur young women to force them to marry Han Chinese so they don't reproduce any Uyghurs, so to speak. They become assimilated as Han Chinese. Is that your experience as well?
That's one of the issues that I did not have a chance to discuss. In that the exclusion measure that I alluded earlier, that was enacted in April 1, 2017, as a provision. It essentially says interfering in your children's love affairs with somebody who is non-Muslim, non-Uyghur could be considered that you have a extremist ideology or you're intoxicated by extremist ideology. With that, if somebody said, oh, your daughter needs to marry the Han Chinese because they have a disproportionate male population now looking for wives, then your family members will be subject to that measure of 2017. So there's so the Uyghur woman cannot say no. We have seen enough video images, pictures, Uyghur woman forced to marry to Han Chinese individuals. But we don't have a specific evidence how much, how many people, how big of the percentage of the population been affected by it. But that's one of their methods. The Uyghur woman always been perceived as a sexual object in the Chinese society because of their looks. Eurasian look very different than the Han Chinese population. And now it's becoming a target. Trusna Ziad, and I talked about in my book, told the world very graphic details of the way that she was treated because of her Uyghur ethnicity. So the forced sterilization, child separation, forced marriages, those are some of the common methods that targeting the Uyghur families or Uyghurs' reproduction rates.
I think we're out of time. We have one more question? Okay, thank you.
Yes, my question is, are there certain parts of the Uyghur culture that the Chinese government deems harmless and is allowed to proceed, such as cuisine? Or is the Chinese government attempting to eradicate their culture in whole?
Yeah, they love Uyghur food. Very popular. Even today, if you go to Uyghur restaurants around the world, in Australia, in the United States, and Germany, you see half of the restaurant patrons happen to be Han Chinese.
Well, thank you very much for sharing. People in the audience and online want to get more information. Where would you send them? I mean,
Go to you can help spread the word, organize events like this. Go to uhrp.org. If you have your extra dollars, you should sign up, monthly draw, or contribute. UHRP does a phenomenal job, and I've been serving as a board chair, as a co-founder. Of course, I have to say all the nice things, but the UHRP needs a lot of financial support, expand its team. A lot of work needs to be done. Even with the very limited resources, with the help of international democracy since 2004, UHRP has produced over 80 programmatic reports that you may find helpful. If you go to uhrp.org, there's a link for you to make financial contribution. There's also a link for you to get access to various reports.
Thank you.